What if I told you that in 1318, a man with one ear walked into the royal court of England and claimed a pig made him king? And his story was so convincing, it nearly brought down the monarchy. This isn't some fairy tale. It's real history, and it's, frankly, baffling. I'm your host, Marcus. Welcome to Dark Ages Uncensored. Today we're talking about John Deydras, medieval England's most audacious con artist. His tale involves royal baby swapping, demonic cats, and homicidal pigs. By the end, you'll question everything you thought you knew about medieval identity. First, let's set the scene. It's 1318 AD. Edward II is on the throne. Edward wasn't exactly winning any King of the Year awards. His reign was a mess. Military disasters, political blunders, and scandalous rumours. Nobles were constantly plotting against him. Into this powder keg of instability, John Deydras drops the most explosive claim imaginable. To truly understand the audacity of John Deydras' claim, we need to grasp the precarious state of England under Edward II. His father, Edward I, known as Longshanks and the Hammer of the Scots, had been a formidable, if sometimes brutal, monarch. He expanded English dominion, solidified legal frameworks, and commanded respect, even fear, from his subjects and rivals. When he died in 1307, England expected a continuation of strong rule. What they got in Edward II was a stark contrast. Edward II was, by most historical accounts, ill-suited for kingship. He lacked his father's martial prowess and political acumen. His disastrous defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 against Robert the Bruce shattered English prestige and left Scotland defiant. Economically, England was struggling, exacerbated by a series of devastating famines, known as the Great Famine from 1315 to 1317, which led to widespread starvation and social unrest. This created a population desperate for answers and solutions, often willing to entertain radical ideas. But perhaps even more damaging than his political and military failings were the whispers about his personal life. Edward II surrounded himself with favourites, most notably Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger. These relationships, perceived as overly intimate and exclusionary by the nobility, sparked outrage and accusations of corrupting the king. Gaveston was even exiled multiple times before being brutally executed by the barons in 1312. Such scandalous affairs undermined the king's authority and moral standing in a deeply religious society. The monarchy, the very foundation of medieval order, seemed to be crumbling from within. It's into this seething cauldron of discontent, famine, and political intrigue that our protagonist, John Deydras, a seemingly insignificant tanner from Oxford, chose to make his move. So who was John Deydras? A nobody. A humble tanner from Oxford. But here's the kicker. He bore a striking resemblance to King Edward II. We're talking double-take level. The only difference? Deydras was missing his right ear. This resemblance was crucial. In an age before photography or widespread portraiture, physical resemblance was often the most powerful form of identification. Chronicles of the time don't offer us detailed physical descriptions, but the fact that contemporary accounts emphasise this likeness suggests it was truly remarkable. It wasn't just a passing similarity, it was enough to make even those who knew the king well pause and wonder. Today, with photo IDs and birth certificates, claiming to be someone else is easily disproven. But medieval England was obviously different. Identity was fluid, documents were sparse. A common person's identity was often established through community recognition, personal reputation, and physical appearance. There were no national registries of births, no standardised identification papers. For most people, a birth certificate was simply the word of their parents and the local parish priest, if records were kept at all. If you looked the part and had a good story, people might just believe you. And boy did John Deydras have a story. Deydras claimed he was the legitimate son of Edward I, making him the rightful heir instead of Edward II. His story went like this. As a royal infant, his wet nurse was caring for him when disaster struck. A sow, a female pig, somehow got into the royal nursery and bit off the baby's ear. In medieval times, harming a royal child wasn't just a firing offence, it was a death sentence. The nurse, terrified, made a desperate decision. She allegedly swapped the mutilated royal baby, our John Deydras, with a local cart driver's ear-intact infant. The cart driver's baby became Edward II, while the real prince was raised in obscurity as a commoner. Think The Prince and the Pauper, but with more pig violence. Now you might be thinking, that's ridiculous. And you'd be right to be sceptical, but you have to understand the medieval mindset. In 14th century England, pig attacks weren't fantasy, they were a genuine hazard. Medieval towns, unlike our sanitized cities, were vibrant, often chaotic places where humans and animals lived in close proximity. Pigs were invaluable for food, but they weren't kept in neat pens. They roamed freely, scavenging for scraps, and were often semi-feral. These weren't the domesticated, docile pigs we see on farms today. They were tough, strong, and could be aggressive, especially if they perceived a threat or were hungry. They weighed hundreds of pounds and possessed tusks capable of inflicting grievous wounds. Child mortality was tragically high, and many deaths were due to accidents, including animal attacks. And there's direct historical precedent. In 1392, just decades after our story, a sow in Oxford killed and partially devoured a 6-month-old girl. The pig was put on trial. Yes, you heard that right. And executed. This wasn't an isolated incident. Medieval court records are full of cases involving animals attacking humans, which we may talk about in a future video, and pigs were particularly problematic. So when John Deydras told his pig attack story, it didn't sound absurd, it sounded plausible. It tapped into a very real, very visceral fear and understanding of the dangers of daily life. The resemblance between Deydras and Edward II was so uncanny that when he was brought before the king, even Edward seemed taken aback. Accounts say the king greeted him with, "Welcome, my brother," which suggests he was either amused or genuinely unsettled. Chronicles like Henry Knighton's provide these details, painting a picture of a king caught between amusement and a flicker of doubt. It's easy to imagine the awkwardness in the royal court, a commoner, missing an ear, standing before the King of England, claiming to be the true king. Edward II's reign was already plagued by legitimacy issues, and this public challenge, no matter how outlandish it seemed to some, struck at the very heart of his right to rule. But if Edward II was amused, Queen Isabella certainly wasn't. Isabella, who would later orchestrate her husband's downfall, immediately saw Deydras as a threat. Isabella was a formidable figure, known as the She-Wolf of France, who would ultimately lead an invasion to depose her husband. She understood the power of perception and the fragility of royal authority. In a world where royal bloodlines were the foundation of power, even a false claim could be destabilizing if enough people believed it. And people were starting to believe. Deydras began attracting followers, disaffected nobles, commoners frustrated with Edward's reign, and political opportunists. His story spread like wildfire, and suddenly, the royal court was facing a medieval conspiracy theory with legs. The social climate was ripe for such a claim to gain traction. The Great Famine had ravaged the land, leaving widespread poverty and desperation. People were looking for scapegoats, for explanations for their suffering. A hidden king, an impostor on the throne, provided a convenient and compelling narrative. It resonated with a deep-seated belief in providential justice, that perhaps God had removed the true king for a reason, and now he was returning. Authorities knew they had to act fast. Deydras was arrested and put on trial for sedition, treason. This was no minor affair. It was a matter of national security, a direct challenge to the crown. The trial itself was likely held in a highly public manner, intended to both discredit Deydras and send a clear message to any other potential impostors or rebellious factions. The legitimacy of the monarchy was at stake, and the ruling powers needed to assert their dominance. But this is where our story takes its most bizarre turn. If we put this in a Netflix series, you'd say the writers jumped the shark. When faced with execution, John Deydras completely changed his tune. He didn't just recant and beg for mercy. No, he came up with an explanation even more unbelievable than his original story. Ready for this? He blamed his cat. According to Deydras' confession, he'd been led astray by his pet cat, which was apparently possessed by the devil. Satan, speaking through this ordinary house cat, had convinced Deydras to make his false claims about being king. The devil's plan, apparently, was to use this elaborate pig and baby swap conspiracy to undermine the English monarchy. I know what you're thinking. The medieval equivalent of the dog ate my homework, but cranked to 11. And you are absolutely right. But in medieval Europe, demonic possession was taken very seriously. The idea that Satan could work through animals wasn't far-fetched. It was accepted theology. The church held immense power and influence, and beliefs in the supernatural, demons, witches, divine intervention, were deeply ingrained in everyday life. As we have mentioned, animal trials, while rare, weren't unheard of. So while outlandish to us, Deydras' explanation, if it were genuinely believed, might have shifted his culpability from conscious treason to unwitting manipulation by demonic forces. The court, however, wasn't buying it. They saw through Deydras' desperate attempt to shift blame. They understood the political implications far outweighed any theological nuances. The verdict was swift and brutal. Both John Deydras and his cat were sentenced to death for sedition. Yes, they executed the cat too. Medieval justice didn't mess around with potential feline accomplices to treason. The Lanercost Chronicle explicitly states that the cat was hanged alongside Deydras, serving as a grim warning about consorting with forces, whether supernatural or otherwise, that threatened the established order. But here's the bigger picture. This story tells us something fascinating about medieval society and politics. Modern historians suggest John Deydras may have suffered from mental illness. His elaborate delusions, his attempt to blame supernatural forces, and his apparent inability to distinguish fantasy from reality all point to psychological issues. This isn't to diminish the very real threat he posed to the crown, but rather to understand the individual at the heart of this bizarre episode. Delusional individuals could and did find fertile ground for their claims in times of social upheaval. Yet his claims gained traction, not because medieval people were gullible, but because the political climate was perfect for this kind of conspiracy theory. Edward II was genuinely unpopular, his legitimacy was already being questioned, and people were looking for alternatives. Deydras' story offered a neat solution. What if the king wasn't really the king? It provided a simple, compelling answer to complex problems. This speaks to how conspiracy theories work. They don't succeed because they're believable on their own merits. They succeed because they tell people what they want to hear. In a time of instability, the idea that the unpopular king was an imposter provided a convenient explanation for why everything was going wrong. It offered a tangible narrative to channel widespread discontent, giving hope to those who sought change and a reason for loyalists to doubt. The Deydras case also reveals how precarious royal authority was in the medieval period. We think of medieval kingship as a rock-solid institution, often backed by divine right and seemingly unquestioning loyalty. But it was much more fragile. Kings ruled by consent as much as by force, and that consent could be withdrawn if enough people decided the king wasn't legitimate. Challenges to the throne weren't always about armies and battles. Sometimes they were about narratives, about who had the more compelling story, about who the populace believed was the rightful ruler. Edward II would eventually face far more serious challenges. He was deposed by his wife and nobles in 1327 and died in captivity, quite possibly murdered. The Deydras affair was just an early warning sign of how unstable his reign really was. It was a bizarre, yet telling symptom of the deep malaise afflicting his rule. There's another fascinating layer to this story: the ease with which Deydras could claim royal identity. Consider the absence of formal documentation. Travel was slow and information spread primarily by word of mouth. For most people, your identity was determined by who you knew, who vouched for you, and your local reputation. If you moved to a new town, you essentially started fresh. This fluidity created both genuine confusion and opportunities for deliberate deception. If you looked the part, acted the part, and told a convincing story, you could convince people you were someone else. This wasn't unique to Deydras. Medieval history is full of imposters. The famous case of Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be one of the princes in the Tower, Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, during the late 15th century, shows how these identity games played out at the highest political level. Warbeck's impersonation nearly toppled King Henry VII. There were also numerous false prophets and false saints who gained significant followings by claiming divine revelation or miraculous powers. The lack of standardized identification systems meant that verification was often a matter of testimony, visual recognition, and circumstantial evidence, all of which could be manipulated. So what can we learn from this bonkers tale of pig-related royal conspiracies and demonic cats? First, medieval people weren't more gullible than us. They operated with different information and assumptions. Their world was steeped in religious belief, oral tradition, and a very real understanding of the dangers of their environment. What seemed plausible to them might seem absurd to us, and vice versa. Second, political instability creates fertile ground for conspiracy theories, regardless of the era. When people are suffering and dissatisfied with their leaders, they are more susceptible to narratives that offer simple explanations or radical solutions. But most importantly, the story of John Deydras reminds us that history is full of weird, wonderful, and unexpected stories that challenge our assumptions. Medieval England wasn't just knights and castles, it was a place where a one-eared tanner nearly convinced a kingdom a pig made him king, and where cats could be executed for treason. The next time someone tells you medieval people lived simple, predictable lives, remind them about John Deydras. Because if there's one thing this story proves, it's that humans have always been complicated, creative, and occasionally completely insane. And that's what makes history so endlessly fascinating. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the weirdest corners of medieval history. This is our first video, and greatly appreciate your support. We've barely scratched the surface, and we've got plenty more tales of imposters, animals, and unhinged political schemes coming your way. Until next time, keep questioning everything, just maybe don't blame it on your cat.